On this March 17th, 2025, we're slipping into the narrow lanes of a medieval town to see how people handled thieves, from watchmen and night bells to stocks, tithings, and the promise of sanctuary. Before we begin, please comment where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. If you enjoy quiet journeys through the past, please like and subscribe. Picture a narrow, winding street under a sky the color of old pewter, where houses lean toward one another and light pools in the middle like a hearth. There were no bright electric signs, no blinking cameras on rooftops, no sudden clean alarm that cut through the night. When a hand slipped furtively into a pocket or a stranger lingered too long by a stall, it was other people, neighbors, shopkeepers, the man on the next roof, who kept the town safe. Keeping watch was not an abstract duty, but the daily breath of communal life. Eyes and ears passed from one person to the next. Gossip turned into evidence, and a single cry could draw half a village into motion. If someone noticed a theft, the response was immediate and unmistakable. A woman might slam her shutter, shout to her sister across the alley, and a barefoot child would sprint to rouse the nearest constable or the pair of watchmen. In many towns, a formal hue and cry bound householders together. Once the alarm sounded, everyone present was legally obliged to give chase. Men grabbed lanterns and sticks, dogs were loosed, and the streets filled with running feet and torchlight. The pursuit took on a fierce theatrical quality. Neighbors calling names, a chorus of accusation that echoed through the lanes, pursuing the suspect until he was either seized or swallowed by the dark. Communities did not leave prevention to chance. Shopkeepers arranged their stalls and counters with care, placing wares behind low barriers or inside chests locked fast. Iron grills and lattices protected window displays, while trusted apprentices stood permanently at the bench. Goods were often handed through small service openings rather than left exposed, and the most valuable items stayed under the owner's hand, weighed and measured only when a buyer had proven plainly honest. Every measure, from a well-placed chest to a wary apprentice's eye, was meant to make theft harder and trust easier. At night, the town itself closed up like a fist. High stone walls and stout gates were shut. Watchmen paced the battlements or the market square, calling the hour and listening for the first hint of trouble. A lantern bobbing along the ramparts, the clatter of a latch, the low murmur of guards on patrol. These sounds were as familiar as the bell and as reassuring. The watchman's call and the sight of a torch in the window told people their neighborhood was still awake and ready. When a thief was caught, judgment could be swift and harsh. Some endured public humiliation in the stocks or pillory, bound and displayed before neighbors while gossip and scorn did their work. Others paid fines into the town coffers. Beyond that, sentences could be severe. Exile, a life cast out without home or kin, or corporal punishment where the law allowed. These penalties were meant to do more than punish. They aimed to recover what was lost, warn others, and reassert the fragile order that kept markets and villages alive. Medieval streets were, in short, a living web of obligation and vigilance. Everyday life depended on knowing your neighbors and on the confidence that a shout would not go unanswered. Thieves certainly walked those lanes, but they did so under the constant presence of human attention. Wary eyes at windows, the bob of a lantern in the dark, and the sure knowledge that, without mechanical alarms, people themselves would rise to protect what they held dear. The clang of iron on iron, the low murmur of a crowd, the hard, tired faces of those who had been caught. These were the constant backdrops to a world that weighed theft as a grave breach of the social fabric. To steal was not merely to take. It was to threaten the fragile trust that bound a market stall to a neighbor's hearth, to unsettle the delicate balance on which small communities survived. So the response was swift and severe, a visible reminder that what one person did could ripple through many lives. Punishments ranged from the cold, isolating certainty of imprisonment, where days blurred into the endless ticking of time behind wooden doors, to the finality of banishment, when a familiar road and the warmth of kin were stripped away, and a person was cast into an unsure world beyond the village bounds. Corporal punishment left stories marked on skin and bone, a visible, painful lesson meant to dissuade others who might be tempted to transgress. Each penalty carried a social weight as well as a physical one, signaling to the wider community that order mattered. Because justice by itself could not hold a town together, ordinary people took on extraordinary roles. Community vigilance became more than a civic duty. It was survival. Neighbors watched one another's doors as a matter of course, voices carried on the wind in sharp warnings, and households learned to look out for one another's children and belongings. This was not the romantic picture of an ever-friendly village. There were tensions, suspicion, and the dull ache of people doing what they had to protect their own. Still, when whole streets joined in the quiet, persistent work of keeping an eye on things, they reduced the chances that desperation would turn into theft, standing in the market to keep a wary watch, or taking turns to guard the grain stores during lean seasons. Shopkeepers, whose livelihoods rested on the constant, fragile trust of customers and trade, developed practical, often ingenious defenses. Counters were arranged to force a slow, deliberate movement through a shop. Goods were tucked into labyrinthine displays that made quick grabs difficult. Trapdoors, locked chests, secret compartments, and bells at thresholds became part of a quiet language of caution. In some cases, the very layout of a stall was a deterrent, designed to confuse a would-be thief's eye and slow a hand intent on taking something small. Perhaps a loaf whose absence could mean ruin. These devices were not melodrama, but everyday engineering, small, clever defenses born from long experience. Yet the reasons people stole were not always rooted in malice or cunning. Economic instability crept through communities like a slow frost, wilting what had once been steady work and ordinary security. Taxes that seemed bearable in good years became crushing in harder seasons, pushing the less fortunate to impossible choices. For some, stealing was a desperate bid for survival, a child's bread, a coat for a freezing night, provisions for a family with no other recourse. The weight of necessity made moral decisions wrenching and raw. People who would never have imagined themselves outside the law found themselves there, driven by hunger and the failure of structures meant to protect them. Into these fraught scenes stepped monastic orders, not merely as distant spiritual authorities, but as active mediators in the life of the community. Monks and sisters, whose daily rhythms were shaped by prayer and work, also carried a role in calming disputes and offering arbitration. Their voices could temper the swift hand of punishment, and their presence reminded neighbors of a larger ethic of mercy and order. Through counsel and mediation, they sought to restore relationships, to repair what had been broken, not only in material terms, but in trust and reputation. By promoting charity, providing outreach in difficult times, and acting as neutral arbiters when tempers flared, these religious communities helped weave back the frayed edges of social life. All of these threads, the harsh punishments, the watchful communities, the wary shopkeepers, the hungry and taxed, and the mediating hands of monastic orders, combined into a living tapestry of everyday life. It was a world in which every alley and every market stall bore the memory of what theft could cost, and where people, in small determined ways, did what they could to keep one another safe without losing their humanity. In the quiet after the market closed, with candlelight glinting on iron bars and the smell of damp straw in the watch house, the work of holding a community together went on, patient and essential. Imagine living in the Middle Ages where every face you passed at the market was more than a stranger with a coin. It was a neighbor whose life was woven with yours by 1,000 small dependencies. Timber houses leaned close together, smoke from hearths braided in the cold air like intertwined threads. And fields were worked to a shared rhythm, the scythes and oxen moving in time because everyone knew that your harvest, your seed, your very roof could be affected by the fortunes of those around you. In a place like that, taking what was not yours was never an abstract crime. It felt like the ripping of an invisible cord that bound orchard to plow, child to teacher, neighbor to friend. When someone stole, it was not merely the loss of goods, but a rupture in the social fabric. A missing loaf, a pilfered tool, or a vanished hen carried the weight of betrayal, a sense that promises had been broken and shared risk had been betrayed. People's voices dropped. Looks followed the accused down the narrow lanes. The conversation at the well grew colder and shorter. Where people once exchanged news and bread with easy trust, there was now suspicion, small silences, and the careful measuring of words. The community, which survived by mutual trust, by sending a hand to mend a fence or a shoulder to lift a stuck wagon, felt personally affronted. Justice, conversation, even gossip became ways to repair what had been harmed, attempts to stitch back the torn ties. For the real injury was the erosion of confidence that let neighbors sleep without fear and let children play without constant watchfulness. Theft struck at the heart of communal life, a wound felt by everyone who depended on the quiet contract of mutual care. At first, the world was smaller and rougher. If someone snatched your cow, you and your family chased them down and settled things yourselves. It was messy, personal, sometimes violent. And, if you're being honest, a strange sort of family bonding time. Justice lived in the hands of neighbors and kin. A debt was repaid, a wound was closed, and life moved on. But as years passed and generations layered over one another, those private reckonings stopped being enough. The simple act of taking what was not yours hardened into something heavier, a rupture in the social fabric that held whole communities together. What had once been a quarrel between two households became, by the late Middle Ages, a public wound that went beyond property to threaten everyday security. Picture a market at dawn, stalls being set up, the baker's breath fogging the cold air, chicken feathers ruffling, a child tugging at a mother's sleeve. In that world, trust was the invisible currency people traded in every hour. One quick hand in a crowded lane, one purse lifted from a strap, could do more than ruin a merchant's day. It cast doubt over every handshake, every barter, every promise, until even familiar faces could seem foreign. So the response shifted from private repayment to public reckoning. The responsibility to judge and punish moved out of the shadows and into the light of authority. Magistrates and officials, the visible faces of law, stepped forward. Trials were held, proclamations read, penalties imposed. These were not only about returning goods, they were meant to restore what had been broken, the sense that the world was orderly and that wrongdoers would be found and accounted for. That change carried a plain, weighty message. Stealing was not merely a theft of things, but a breach of the polity itself. To take what belonged to another was to challenge the rules that let towns trade, let parents sleep at night, let strangers pass one another on the road without fear. By making the state responsible for punishment, society marked how corrosive such betrayals had become. The punishments could be stern, even harsh. But beneath that severity lay a common aim: to repair the breach, to signal that order remained, and to protect the fragile trust on which daily life depended. In the end, those public responses were less about revenge and more about rescue, saving the invisible ties that made communities possible. By the later Middle Ages, theft had come to be seen as a threat so serious that some contemporaries treated it more gravely than even homicide. Scholars like Valérie Touré have pointed out how shifting social attitudes and changing laws turned stealing into a major offense, not just a private wrong. Monastic orders also played a part in this shifting landscape. Monks and abbots sometimes stepped in to mediate disputes, preach order, and remind communities of both mercy and the need for stability, underlining how theft was felt as a matter that concerned the whole village or town. Imagine a market square, the clatter of hooves, the murmur of bargaining, the bright scent of spices and tack. Then a sharp change, a gasp, a merchant's outraged cry, the sudden scuffle as pursuers give chase. In that instant, a life might tilt toward a future few today would picture. The history of how thieves were punished is not a single spectacle, but a long, uneven story of law and custom, of local councils and lordly courts, of compassion rubbing against cruelty as communities tried to protect property and keep order. In the earliest years, justice was close and communal. A stolen loaf or a pilfered blanket was often handled at home. Neighbors gathered, elders listened, and remedies leaned toward restitution. Make good what was taken, perhaps pay a fine, or offer a public apology. The aim was to restore balance to a fragile social web, not merely to punish one person. Shame itself was a powerful sanction. Rituals of penance or public contrition could wound a reputation more deeply than metal or flame. But as settlements grew and markets spread, those familiar customs gave way to more formal procedures. Lords and their manorial courts, bishops and ecclesiastical tribunals, urban magistrates and the slowly emerging royal authorities all claimed the right to decide cases at different times and places. The language of sin mixed with the language of property and law. What had once been a neighborly settlement became a question of power. Who could define guilt? Who could impose penalties? Who had the authority to speak for the community? That shift changed the mood of punishment. Deterrence, making an example to warn others, grew in importance. Punishments became public spectacles. A thief might be locked in the stocks or the pillory at the town center, exposed to jeers and the toss of rotten food. Corporal penalties such as whipping, branding, or the cutting of a hand were meant to leave an unmistakable record on the body. For those judged most culpable, death was sometimes the final sentence. Executions were staged, ritualized, meant to remind the living of both the price of stealing and the power that enforced the law. Social realities, however, shaped how these rules were applied. A noble or a man with connections could often expect a softer fate than the hungry laborer who took bread in desperation. The poor disproportionately bore the brunt of harsh measures, and the new legal frameworks often hardened inequalities instead of easing them. In a period when economies and communities were fragile, the pursuit of order could be merciless, its methods designed to stabilize what seemed unstable by making disorder visibly and painfully costly. Listen closely to the sounds of that past: the creak of wooden stocks, the crack of a lash, the hush before a sentence is read, the distant tolling of a convent bell calling for mercy. You hear more than punishment. You hear a world trying, imperfectly and unevenly, to balance mercy and control, to protect both possessions and people, to stitch a community back together after every injury. As population, commerce, and authority pressed in, the consequences for theft grew harsher and more complex. The result was a tapestry of justice that could be pragmatic and brutal, humane and unforgiving. A human story written in law, ritual, and sometimes in suffering. Imagine living in a world where stealing could land you in prison, get you banished from your home, or worse, subjected to corporal punishment. By the 12th century, this hard line was becoming the norm, part of a wider shift in how communities treated property crimes. Theft was not a private matter. It was a breach that demanded a public answer. The late Middle Ages was a time when even small gestures could carry enormous consequences, and nowhere was that more true than in the question of stolen goods. In villages and towns where people lived cheek by jowl and survival depended on a web of reciprocal favors, taking another person's bread, tools, or coin was not merely an economic loss. It was a wound to trust. Households, guilds, and manors were bound together by mutual obligations, and when someone took what belonged to another, they ripped at the invisible threads that held daily life together. For many, the moral outrage was even greater than that felt at murder. Killing destroyed a life, but theft corroded the common life that made survival possible. Picture a market square at dusk, tavern candles guttering, carts being overturned and loaded, the town constable walking the gate to lock it for the night. Rumors of a theft travel faster than any official notice. Faces harden, conversations go quiet, and suspicion hangs in the air like frost. An accusation cuts through the town, not only because property is lost, but because the assumption that people would act in good faith has been violated. Preachers and local leaders warned that when trust broke down, trade withered, hospitality dried up, and the social fabric began to fray. Into that tense atmosphere stepped the judges. Sometimes it was the lord of the manor who sat in judgment, sometimes a royal or ecclesiastical officer, and sometimes a local magistrate whose authority rested as much on respect as on formal power. Their benches were not simply seats of law, but places of deep judgment, where character and circumstance mattered alongside facts. They had wide discretion. A man who stole out of desperate hunger might be treated differently from a professional thief who preyed on travelers. A frightened youth could be spared where an adult was punished. A freeman could expect different treatment than a serf. The judge listened to more than the taking itself, to the debtor's tears, the witness's reluctant nod, the accused's steady gaze, and tried to weigh the life behind the crime. Punishments were as varied as the cases. Some aimed to repair trust and restore order, restitution to the victim, a public apology, or labor performed for the community. Others aimed to deter by inflicting shame or pain, the pillory, fines, branding, or corporal penalties for those deemed incorrigible. Banishment and imprisonment were used when removal from the community or secure confinement seemed necessary. Every sentence spoke to the community's need for reassurance. It had to say, loudly and unmistakably, that rights would be defended and the social compact would endure. The result was a system of justice that felt personal and communal, flexible and exacting. Judges could be merciful or severe, guided by the particularities of each case rather than a single, cold formula. From the hum of the village hearth to the bustle of crowded courts, the conviction that theft betrayed the trust upon which medieval life depended shaped how people lived, loved, and feared, coloring everyday interactions with the constant awareness that property and the faith of neighbors were inseparable. In that world, the rules were written in flesh and fate. Repeat offenders faced execution, a blunt final answer that left little room for mercy. Mutilation, the cutting away of an ear or the like, was another kind of judgment, a permanent, visible brand that announced you a thief and warned the rest. You could feel how hard the stakes pressed on people. The air itself seemed to hold its breath when decisions were being made, and a hush would fall across a room as if sound could upset the balance. Little things mattered there. Small shifts or lapses could ripple outward and change everything. That's why even a single ordinary piece of candy carried more weight than it ever would in a softer place. Picture it close, a wrapper between your fingers, the faint crinkle of thin paper, a sound that might promise pleasure or signal danger. A sweet can be bait and test both, a bright, simple treasure that comforts as it tempts. When a child stretches for a sibling's treat, it isn't only about taste, it becomes a question of trust. Will this be forgiven, or will it mark you? Will it be noticed now, or smolder into something that changes how you move through the world? A tiny theft could be the first thread to pull at a garment of reputation. In a community where consequences compounded, reputations and relationships were fragile and quick to fracture. One small misstep could tilt how neighbors looked at you, how family members guarded their doors. That's what made discretion and timing feel like survival skills. So the next time a temptation whispers, the wrapper catching the light, the sugar calling like an easy prize, take a breath. Consider the quiet ledger of things owed and given, the way favors and betrayals stack up over time. Look at the face of the person beside you, the one who will feel the loss or the breach of trust. Remember the long tail of small moments, how tiny acts can swell into lasting marks. In a place where punishments were severe and marks were literal, think twice before you reach. Even if you never stop to think about it now, picture a village in the Middle Ages, long after the sun has slipped behind thatched roofs and the market stalls lie dark. The lamps are gut-wick and guttering, casting a thin, trembling light. Lanes smell of damp straw and wood smoke. They ring with the clop of a pony's hooves and the occasional bark of a dog. In that small world, stealing was not merely a private wrong, it threatened the fragile weave that held everyone together. So when a purse vanished from a stall or a cart was stripped of its harness, the alarm did not wait for a distant official to arrive. It rose from the people themselves. A single shout could become the town's voice. Neighbors who had eaten together the night before, who had drawn water from the same well and mended each other's fences, grabbed torches and axes and went out into the dark. Old women who knew every face in the street moved like living memory. Apprentices who kept late hours slipped into the lanes with boots still muddy from the mill. The miller who heard every creak of his wheel listened for an unfamiliar tread. Each had a part to play. The torchlight caught on copper buckles and the glint of a worried eye. The sound of many feet made the night feel less empty. Men and women formed lines through alleys, called names as if naming might turn luck in their favor, and listened for the soft, telltale scuff of someone trying to pass unseen. Children were sent from cottage to rouse sleepers. Someone might run to the church and set the bell swinging so the whole parish knew to come. The community's anger and fear were practical things, translated into action. A cordon thrown around the suspected quarter, a trail followed by the light of many hands, a watch kept through the night so that no one could slip away under cover of shadows. There was also the moral pressure. In a world where people depended on one another for bread, shelter, and law, failing to help the search marked you as an outsider. Families feared the shame of harboring a thief. A household that hid a stranger risked losing the trust that kept markets trading, farms working, and marriages arranged. Reputation was not idle pride, but a kind of currency, worth as much as coin when it came to securing help, work, or a fair hearing in disputes. So prevention itself became communal and almost routine. Fences were mended by common labor before winter, gates were barred at dusk by agreement, and neighbors took turns keeping watch along the lane. Theft was fought not only with spears and shouts, but by the plain, steady care of a society that knew how closely its survival depended on the willingness of every person to answer a cry in the night. In that way, the village itself was a kind of living defense, stitched together by the small axe, by the torch lent to a stranger, the name called into the dark, the bell that would never be silent when danger came. Community involvement wasn't optional. It was an expectation that held the town together. If you stood by while a thief worked, you risked being seen as part of the crime. Action was required, and silence was suspect. Vigilance was less a law than a way of life. Row upon row of narrow streets wound through the town, a tangle of timber frames and low eaves where life unfolded within arm's reach of the market. Shopkeepers did not live behind gates. Their beds and fires were almost above the counters and windows where business was done. By day they opened their shutters and stood half inside, half out into the lane, eyes trained on the steady flow of customers and the small porches where coins and goods changed hands. By night, a single lamp, a flicker in a window, or the murmur of a neighbor told them someone had passed. That watching was shared by families. A mother would draw a curtain to glance out, an apprentice would pause sweeping the stoop, an old man would stop on his way to gossip. Each look and nod stitched a net across the neighborhood. Faces were remembered, footsteps registered, familiar baskets and cloaks noted as quickly as a bell announced the hour. The town's life itself acted as a kind of guard, a chorus of ordinary movements that kept watch without a word. In a place like that, a would-be thief found no quiet shadow in which to work. With so many eyes and such steady attention, stealth was often abandoned before it began, and the small economies of the lanes were kept safe by the relentless, human watchfulness that bound neighbors to one another. If someone dared to steal, they risked ostracization, a social no-no in a world where reputation meant everything. Imagine being the medieval outcast, doors closed against you, neighbors turning away, your name whispered at the tavern. Now step through the low doorway of a town stall and you feel how different these shops are from the bright open emporiums we know today. The air is close with the mixed scents of wax, leather, and spices. Light from a single window falls in a strip across the floor, leaving corners draped in shadow. The space is built not for casual wandering, but for careful, deliberate movement. Narrow aisles twist between tall racks and barrels, and counters stand like small ramparts. Customers must move slowly, stoop, and often peer through a hatch or past a raised board to see the goods. It's easy to picture a swift thief finding no clear path to bolt for the street. Shopkeepers learned to turn architecture itself into protection. Counters were high and solid, shelves recessed or curtained, prized items set behind iron grills or small service windows that allowed a hand to pass but kept the valuables out of reach. Things that could not be watched were kept in locked chests or hung in places that could only be reached with the shopkeeper's help. The layout was almost a maze by design. Narrow, irregular passages forced anyone moving through the stall to be visible from the till. There were no long, open runways for a quick escape, only short stretches watched by a keen eye, where a careful glance could take in a whole customer's progress. An apprentice stands near the door, alert to every footstep, the small bell above the latch a constant, immediate signal. The shopkeeper's posture is strikingly dual, hospitable at a tilt of the head, but ready in an instant to close the distance between a suspicious customer and the counter. As dusk falls, heavy shutters are pulled across the windows, and iron bolts slid into their sockets. The city's watch may pace the street outside, but inside the craftsman trusts the clever configuration of his own space as the first line of defense. You can hear the creak of wood, the soft clink of coins by candlelight, the faint scuff of a hurried shoe. Small sounds that mean everything in a place so tightly ordered. In these cramped, carefully arranged interiors, commerce and caution move together. Design and habit, sightlines and locks, apprentices and shutters, all of it becomes part of a practical, lived security. It's a world where the shape of a counter or the placement of a shelf can protect a livelihood, and where social consequence sits beside physical defense, keeping both goods and reputation safe in equal measure. Shopkeepers learned early how to keep curious hands at bay. Half doors and flap shelves became part of the storefront's grammar, an unspoken invitation to look but don't touch. Those simple fixtures were clever, practical defenses, small theatrical gestures that kept goods visible for sale while keeping them just out of reach of anyone with dishonest intent. They built on those tricks with locks and physical barriers, everyday truths given form in iron and effort. When vigilance and polite warnings weren't enough, hands reached for keys, hinges groaned, and bolts slid home. Metal bars were set across windows, and doors like a blunt answer to the night, cold, straight lines of steel turning a vulnerable opening into a stubborn problem for a would-be thief. You could hear a blacksmith's anvil in the background, sparks flying as he hammered out the pieces that would keep a family or a shop safe through many long nights. Those bars and bolts, of course, came at a cost. The price could make a household pause. Coins counted, arguments had, compromises weighed between comfort and caution. People learned to balance risk against peace of mind. Choosing a stout lock or a length of forged iron meant parting with money now in exchange for the quieter mornings that might follow. The simple ability to close a door and walk away without the nagging fear that something would be gone by dusk. And when the bolt held, the value was plain in small human ways. A parent's slow, relieved exhale, a merchant drawing shutters without a tremor in their hands, neighbors moving through the streets with a little less suspicion. The cold promise of metal did more than fend off hands. It bought time, steadied nerves, and let everyday life continue. In the end, that modest outlay for security proved itself again and again, turning expense into reassurance and making the hard, honest labor of protection pay off in calm mornings and fewer irreparable losses. Community vigilance was key. Shopkeepers often lived above or behind their stalls, keeping a watchful eye and nudging neighbors to do the same. Not out of paranoia, but because they understood how thin livelihoods were and how narrow the streets could be. They leaned into one another the way people do when the world feels close, in quiet plans and small gestures. As dusk slid down the lane, merchants folded pallets of goods into the dimming light, counted coins with fingers that still smelled of oil and flour, and kept up a stream of jokes and bartered stories to keep the last customers at ease. All the while they set little measures against another kind of night visitor, the one who came for more than a bargain. Those precautions were humble, the kind of ingenuity born of necessity. A bell hung where a back door met its frame. A loosely tied ribbon would tug a clapper when pulled. A scrap of wire threaded through the rafters would shiver and send a hollow ping that ran along the beams. Each device was simple, made from what was at hand, and designed to be heard. They were not snares meant to trap a person. They were voices, small mechanical alarms that spoke the moment something was wrong. At the first clatter or soft jangling, lanterns were lifted, shutters were thrown open with a sharp bark, and a dozen ordinary people scattered through rooms and alleys became a single ready force. There was an economy of care in those acts. A shopkeeper did not set down his ledger and go looking for trouble. He trusted the sound to reach a neighbor, to stir a wife or apprentice from sleep, to send a child running with a lantern. The alarm was an invitation to attention, to presence, a simple signal that the community mattered more than any single counter. Hands reached for one another in the dark, not in panic, but in practiced cooperation. Voices hushed and then rose with purpose. Footsteps answered footsteps. So the traps were modest and the response was human, not the cold gleam of law, but the warm habit of people watching out for one another. That kind of preparedness spoke louder than any lock. It said, "We see you, we guard our own, and if anyone thinks to take what is not theirs, they will find not an empty street, but an entire neighborhood on its feet." Now that's teamwork. Imagine a village at dusk. Thin gray threads of smoke rise from thatch-roofed cottages, the last light slipping from muddy lanes, as children race home with ragged bundles of firewood. Most people in the Middle Ages lived in places like this, bound to the soil and to obligations that rarely appeared in ink, but were felt in the bones. Coins might clink in distant halls, and cathedrals could glitter with donated plate. Yet for common folk, the world of cash was a narrow, urgent thing. A trickle that had to pay the season's rent, the church's claim, the Lord's demands, and whatever fines the manor court might invent. When that trickle dried, there was truly nowhere to turn. Taxes and dues were not abstract lines on a ledger. They were the difference between a warm hearth and an empty one. The church's tithe, a tenth of what a household produced, took from grain and lambs and, in effect, from the cloth on which a child slept. Lords expected rent and labor by custom, and manor courts could impose fines that tightened like a belt. Markets brought their own charges, tolls at bridges, customs at gates, a little taken from every cart and every bundle sold at a fair. In towns, merchants and craftsmen paid guild dues and licensing fees that could eat into thin profits. Coin was scarce and merciless. Fail to pay, and consequences arrived quickly and publicly. Faced with that pressure, two things tended to happen. The first was thrift and ingenuity. People learned to bend rules to survive, hiding extra bushels of grain in secret pits, coaxing more from poor soil with borrowed plows, trading favors when money ran out. The second, and more dangerous, was that necessity nudged many past the law. Theft, lifting a loaf, pocketing a few eggs, trapping a rabbit on a lord's ground, was often less a moral failing than an act of survival. To a mother whose children had not eaten for a day, The legal line between property and life must have seemed brutally thin. Poaching, petty pilfering, and the occasional raid on a granary could mean the difference between life and death, turning neighbors into desperate actors rather than villains in a cloak. Communities reacted with a mixture of pity, pragmatism, and strict order. Manor courts and town councils worked to keep a fragile peace. Punishments were public and meant to shame as much as to punish. Fines and forced labor were common, and the specters of pillory and whipping existed to deter others. Exile was a particularly cruel sentence. Cast out of the village, a person often faced starvation or else joined a growing class of wanderers and outcasts who were quickly labeled dangerous for the simple crime of having no home. In practice, the law that defended property could harden into a weapon against poverty. A father branded a criminal for stealing bread remained the symptom of a system that left him with no choices. The emotional landscape matched the harshness of the laws. Pride and fear were always entangled. A farmer who could not meet his dues felt shame. A merchant who defaulted feared the loss of credit and reputation. Families watched their flocks thin and their granaries rot, and understood that a single bad season could erase years of hard work. They grieved quietly, bargaining with God and confiding in the local priest, while quietly plotting small acts of resistance to keep their own alive. A little furtive bartering, a hidden hen here, a borrowed seed there. These were survival strategies wrapped in discretion. At the same time, those charged with keeping order had their own worries. Magistrates and guildsmen punished theft not only to recover goods, but to reassure a shaken public that the fragile mechanisms of exchange could still be trusted. Trade depended on a sense that bargains would be honored, and that markets would not descend into chaos. Visible punishment for thieves was as much about restoring confidence as it was about justice. Yet that visible justice often fell disproportionately on those who could least bear it. Across the medieval world, money and social structure braided together to decide who was thought honest and who was cast out. The economy shifted with the weather of harvests, the movements of markets, and the whims of power. It was not fixed, but the day-to-day pressures left few gentle choices for many households. When coin was demanded and could not be produced, when custom and law favored those with halls and storehouses over those with a single field and loaf, theft ceased to be an abstract crime and became heartbreakingly practical. Life was hard then. Hunger sharpened the edges of necessity, and the law, meant to protect property, often fell hardest on those who could least afford it. Return, if you will, to that dusk-lit lane. A woman pulls her child closer as a cart creaks past, the distant sound of a bell from the manor hall underscoring the hush. Around them, survival is a quiet, stubborn work. Prayer, thrift, small defiance, played out beneath the same sky that watches both the glittering plate in the cathedral and the thin gray smoke rising from humble roofs. When raids came or the weather turned, when a failed harvest or a storm ripped away a season's safety, families found themselves trapped at the bottom of an unforgiving ledger. Debt reached like a hand, and for some the answer was crime. They did not step into a welcome. Law-abiding neighbors tightened the circle, and society's suspicion followed them like a shadow. At the same time, the rise of village markets, busy places where new goods and fresh coin flowed through town, created easy opportunities for theft. Merchants, suddenly rich with stock they had once only dreamed of, became bright targets. Taverns, where voices and laughter blurred faces, offered places to hide in plain sight. And with few formal policemen to patrol the lanes, thieves found the cover they needed to keep moving. In those streets, rules were held more by custom than by a book. People enforced one another's behavior because they had to. The stability of the group was literally what kept their doors locked and their pantries filled. There was an unspoken covenant. If a man took what did not belong to him, he was expected to share, or at least to make an offering back to the community that had let him move among them. To keep the whole of a stolen haul for oneself was not merely greed. It was a betrayal of a fragile trust. a breach of the invisible contract that made crowded alleys livable. Word traveled fast in such places. Rumor hardened quickly into judgment. Neighbors who once shared bread and gossip grew thin-lipped and turned their backs. And one act of refusal could set a whole neighborhood's patience alight like tinder to a single spark. The punishments that followed were severe by design, meant as much to warn others as to punish the guilty. The offender found himself shunned. His name was passed with hard eyes and low voices. Doors that had opened for him before closed without ceremony. He was cut off from the common table, excluded from the help networks that everyone relied on, and left exposed to the full weight of communal censure. Those who had depended on the loose tolerances of a bustling street discovered how lonely and dangerous it could be to stand outside the expectations of the many. The community's answer was not subtle. It was a blunt instrument wielded to preserve the small order everyone needed to survive. Into that world, the shopkeeper carved out a cautious life. Day after day, they watched the lanes for trouble, counted stock until their fingers ached, and learned that safety often came through small, steady compromises. To keep a stall open and a family fed, many merchants accepted the humiliating calculus of protection money. Regular payments made less as charity and more as insurance against loss. Those payments sat like an extra bill on already taut shoulders. Merchants tightened their margins, left the least profitable goods on the shelf, and folded the cost of survival into every price. Customers felt the squeeze. Coins bought less. Bargains grew rare. And the act of buying food or tools carried the quiet knowledge that someone else's need for security had been paid for from the buyer's purse. So the market moved on, a tapestry of trade stitched through with compromises. The community's harsh justice and the quiet extortion of protection money answered the same threat in different ways, and both left marks on the people who lived and traded there. The ordinary rhythms of buying and selling were braided with anxiety and restraint. Every exchange bore the shadow of what it cost to keep the lamps burning and the doors open. During lively festivals and bustling markets, towns did something you might not expect. They set up special courts and extra crime prevention measures just for the occasion. When the streets swelled with visitors and the air filled with music and shouting, the risk of theft rose too. People knew a vibrant market needed a bit of order, and maybe a laugh or two, so judges, watchmen, and quick rules appeared to keep the chaos from becoming calamity. The rise of coinage changed things as well. As money and coins became more common, the value of stolen goods grew, and with it the stakes for every purse snatched or stall plundered. Imagine living in a town where every shadow might hide a hand reaching for your purse, where laughter in the market can shift in an instant to alarm as a figure slips between stalls. The Middle Ages were like that. Narrow, crooked streets lit by sputtering torches and moonlight, where people learned early to walk with care and instinct. There were no locks and alarms like we have now. Safety came from constant attention, from neighbors watching neighbors, from shopkeepers arranging their counters so nothing could be taken without notice, and from communities that treated theft not as a private wrong, but as an offense that threatened everyone. Walk through a market at dusk, and you would see the choreography of that vigilance. Stallholders kept their goods within arm's reach and behind low barriers. The most valuable wares sat in locked chests or were hidden under cloth until the moment they were needed. Windows were small and shuttered, doorways narrow so a thief could not slip past unnoticed. Merchants sat with their backs to walls, eyes sweeping the crowd, learning to read the tilt of a cloak or the hesitation of a hand. These were not mere tricks of display, but survival tactics, practiced day after day until the town itself felt like an instrument of watchfulness. Beyond the open stalls, that same watchfulness threaded into the alleys and courtyards. People listened for unfamiliar footsteps, for the sharp clink of coin purses dropped in haste, for the muffled curse of someone caught. News traveled on the same channels as gossip, carried by neighbors and guild members who knew each other's faces and habits. A woman might spot a scrap of stolen fabric tucked around a stranger's waist. A guildsman might recognize the way a certain thief worked the crowd. Within moments, the accused could find themselves surrounded by a chorus of witnesses rather than left to a single accusation. When theft was proven, justice was public and often harsh. Punishments ranged from months in a damp cell to the bitter exile of being cast out of the only world a person knew. For the worst betrayals, fate could be even harsher. These penalties were meant to do more than serve revenge. They were lessons written for the whole town. The fear of disgrace, of losing home and kin, kept many hands from reaching where they did not belong. The memory of a public punishment hung over market days like a warning bell. Yet the town's vigilance did not come only from fear. It grew from necessity and mutual care. In a world where crops, livestock, and traded goods decided whether a family would eat, keeping thieves at bay was shared work. Men and women stood guard for one another, called out when something seemed wrong, and gathered together to right a wrong. The same eyes that watched for thieves also watched for neighbors in need. In that tense balance between mistrust and mutual care, medieval towns created a kind of security that relied less on stone walls and more on people. Every doorway, every shutter, every careful glance was part of a social web that protected the markets and the lives woven through them. It was imperfect and sometimes brutal, but it was real. A community on constant alert, holding itself together by the steady, watchful attention of its own people.